So I'm going to very quickly introduce Z, and then the format. Format's the same for all students. And then Z is going to start with a brief introduction of herself. The pigeonhole has already been sent in the bootcamp all, but for those of you who didn't get a link, that's where it is. So please put your questions there. So yeah, Z. Z was a classmate of Kai's. That's how they know each other from Stanford. But Z has a fairly tenured background. Currently, she's engineering manager at Databricks. And Databricks is software tools for data engineering, analytics, machine learning. Before that, Z was engineering manager at Samsara, which is industrial IoT company, Internet of Things company. Prior to that, product manager at Ministry of Manpower here in Singapore, and tech lead at GovTech. So Z studied at Stanford, I think a bit of computer science, a bit of management science. It's also where she knew Kai. We may have students, a community from the Tech for She, ladies from the Tech for She joining us. For those of you who don't know, Tech for She is a tech empowerment community. I think not just local to Singapore. Kai, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've only really heard about them.
I think they're international, yeah.
International,
but they started from Singapore.
Yeah, and Z has, I wouldn't call it a passion. Z has a real, what's the word? I guess a passion.
I think of it as like
she's a champion. She's a champion of like women and minorities and tech. Yeah, that's it. So Z's LinkedIn is on Bootcamp All. You can check it out. The Q&A pigeonhole link is there, so please get questions. Yeah, Z, take it away.
Yep, I will take it away. So, hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, and yeah, thanks Kai for giving me the space to share a little bit about myself. So yeah, I'm an engineering manager, and as all engineering managers do, I have a little bit of a slide deck to structure my thoughts. I don't know how many people prepare decks for these things, but there you go. I am the one. Cool. So yeah, I'll do a quick introduction about myself. I was born in China. I moved to Singapore when I was pretty young, and now I live in the US. So, I tend to think of myself as someone who has immigrated kind of multiple times in my life. And I think, that is a large part of my identity. I went to Stanford. Kai and I knew each other freshman dorm, actually. Yeah. So we've known each other for 10 years now, which is more than 10 years, actually, which is scary. Yeah. And, I think a big interest of mine, and it still continues to be an interest of mine, is, technology. The thesis of like technology is an extension of human intent, right? So I think I first heard about this through actually an anthropology class. So, if you've ever heard of the aphorism of like, oh yeah, guns don't kill, people do. That is an example of like, okay, like everything we build, it's not, and guns are technology as much as, knives are technology as much as writing is technology, right? So there has been like a long human history of technology. And, today we are building technology too. So, I think the meta point I'm trying to make here is like, it's been part of how we've been humans. And I think we can view a lot of what modern technology is from the perspective of, technology as an extent of human intent. So I'll shut up about that, but, feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in like talking a little bit more philosophical about my specific interests. So moving on to what I did in college, I did a lot of CS, I did a lot of product design, and I took a bunch of entrepreneurship classes. And, one of, I would say, my proudest achievement from that period is I took a startup class called Lean Launchpad. It's conducted by a guy called Steve Banks, and, it's pretty well known, at least at Stanford, for launching quite a few startups. And I happened to be part of a team that, one of the teammates went on to found this company called Zoom. It's now almost a $1 billion company. And you can see up there on the right, a little bit of history. So that was one of our initial sketches of the value proposition of Zoom. So this was essentially, it started off with this idea of like Uber for kids. Of course, Ritu, who is the founder of Zoom, has taken it to beyond just that. But you can see, the very brief sketches of what the value proposition was. Cool. So after college, I really wanted to use my skills to help people. So I kind of took this opportunity to come back to Singapore, and I was fortunate enough to be really one of the first founding members of GovTech. So GovTech today, my understanding, is a pretty large organization. There's probably like 300 or 400 engineers. I, again, was fortunate enough. I was kind of, one of the second engineers on this then still small team. The goal of GovTech was and still is to build digital products for citizens and businesses. So had a bunch of learnings there. I think, one big one was not so much specifically around software engineering skills, but really like the culture of building products. So I think one of the key reasons why GovTech was formed was a series of issues where there was a very rigid project spec. These were like hundreds of pages of specifications. And when you built that, and it took you 2 or 3 years, you found that it didn't work, right? So it was really important to move towards a model of iterative product discovery, where you were launching minimum viable products, ideally like not more than 6 months into a project, but maybe even before, and really validating your product assumption as you invest more effort into it. And another kind of like insight that I had was a lot of how we built the product was formed around the requirements of the government and the people who processed, for example, in my case, it was WorkPass applications. But that doesn't make for a great user experience, and it doesn't make for a very good user product. So really moving from that, from government processes to really like focusing on the user experience and thinking on, of the product from that perspective. Cool. Any questions at this point? I don't know if people wanted to jump in or wanted to clarify things.
Yeah, if anyone from the floor has questions specific to the sharing, you can always ask now. You don't have to wait.
Yeah. That's a picture of me with some of my then colleagues in Ministry of Manpower. I think what was I doing? I think I was giving a presentation on or a workshop on like product discovery or something like that, or user research.
Given your experience in GovTech, would you recommend joining GovTech?
I think you also have a time date.
It's recorded.
Right. Okay. Okay. Maybe don't answer the question.
Yeah. I think it's situational, right? Like, I think it's, I think it's a great organization for engineering. I actually found that one of the benefits of working in the government was you actually had more luxury to make better engineering decisions because there was less kind of revenue and profit pressure. And actually, the government also really emphasized inclusive design, because a government is not a place, you can't like choose your customers, right? You can't say that like, oh yeah, I'm going to build this app just for, like able-bodied sighted people, right? So I think it's actually, it depends on your values, and it depends on kind of like what you're trying to learn. But yeah, I think that, it's a good engineering org. And I personally I both learned a lot, and I was able to like contribute in ways that I was suited to do. Yeah. Cool. Great. So yeah, I think around 2018, I kind of was like, oh, like I've done some engineering, I've done some product management. I personally felt like there was a lot more to learn on technology. And one particular area that I was pretty interested in is IoT. So I took the chance to join a startup here in Silicon Valley called Samsara. So there I joined as an IC, individual contributor, and I eventually became an engineering manager. Samsara scaled a lot during the time that I was here, or I was there. And it was really interesting. There were a lot of growing pains, both on kind of the people organizational side of things and the product side of things. And I think some things I learned from Samsara is personal alignment with company vision is important. I think one very personal reason why I eventually decided to leave was I did have a little bit of discomfort with some of the dashcam products that Samsara was producing. So these were like, smart dash cams, which yeah, I think we can debate on the value and virtue of AI powered computer vision powered dash cams. I personally didn't feel like I was necessarily aligned with that. So that was one reason, and I think that was a big takeaway for me. And then actually another important thing that I learned was how to execute. So going back to whether you should join GovTech, I think the disadvantage of having not a revenue motive is it does make prioritization much more challenging, and it makes execution. I wouldn't say that people are not geared towards execution, but it's just harder to make those decisions. So I think at Samsara, at first I was surprised by some of the lack of processes. I was like, oh, I'm here in Silicon Valley. I'm supposed to be learning good engineering practices. And actually, people are cutting corners, right? But in my kind of 3 years there, I was like, okay, there are right corners to cut and there are wrong corners to cut. So, a really important part of, becoming a more mature engineer is learning when to cut the right corners, when to cut the wrong corners, and how to do it in a way that doesn't hurt the product and the future of the product. Cool. So yeah, those are some images of the product. So there's a dash cam, and then there is what is called a vehicle gateway. So this is a device that plugs into a vehicle and actually helps in fleet operations where you're able to track the location of these vehicles. You're able to know how much fuel the vehicle has and the speed of the vehicle, etc. So it's it's actually really cool. And I'm still a big believer. I'm definitely a big believer in industrial IoT. And then this was this is actually kind of a experiment that we were doing, and I won't go into it, but basically it involved accelerometer readings and figuring out an algorithm to know what the orientation of the device is based on the accelerometer readings. So sufficient to say, I was very out of my element, having not taken physics beyond, Sec 2. But yeah, it was really cool to work with much more experienced engineers than me. Cool, great. Moving on now to today. So, oops, I skipped the slide. So yeah, so I work at Databricks now. I'm an engineering manager, and I work on this project called Workspace 2.0. It probably doesn't sound, super intuitive to most people here. I don't know how much people know about Databricks in Singapore. So I'll give a really short description of it. Essentially what Databricks does is it's a product it's a data platform. So if people here think about companies like Facebook and LinkedIn and Google and Amazon, you probably know that they pay a lot of money, but they're also making super normal profits in the stock market, or they're doing very well in the stock market based on the size of their people, right? And the reason why they do so well is really because of data. And this is not just gathering data, it's also utilizing that data in a way that informs product decisions. So how a lot of these companies are able to do so is that they have teams of thousands of software engineers building data platforms. So the mission of Databricks is, okay, we know that there's this really powerful thing called data, but how do we make sure that everybody can use it? Databricks is a product that you as a company can purchase in order to have a data platform to make use of data. So in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is that, what Databricks is trying to do is to really bridge the gap between, Apple and Google and all these companies who can afford to hire and attract, thousands of engineering talent, and a company who, you might be a pharmaceutical company, you might be a mining company, a company that, your core technology is not software, but you still want to make use of that data. Yeah, and, I'm not going to go too much into, more specifics about what I do, but I would say key learnings, again, a different stage is, what's beyond execution. So execution is very, it's one dimension of engineering management. So, the things that I'm a lot more focused on building is how to hire, how to develop my team, how to have difficult conversations. And I think, something that I always ask myself is how do I scale myself? I only have certain amount of time in a day. how do I make an impact outside of what I can do? So this is one example, but there are countless other things that I'm trying to do to scale myself. Cool. And then the future. So, I think for me, if I look at my career trajectory, is really, I've been in the B2B space for, almost 10 years now. So I would say that, like, if I can summarize my mission in life, it's in these 3 sentences. Most people spend 40 hours of their week at work, and 90% of that is spent interacting with software. So, why can't we build, or why can't I build enterprise software experiences to be as delightful and functional as consumer apps? So I think that last sentence still needs to be a little refined. So I would welcome any suggestions for how to make that less wordy. Yeah. Cool. And here is a bonus picture of my dog, looking quizzically at all of you. So yeah.
What's the dog's name?
Yeah. Oh, Chio.
Chio?
Yeah, it's like a Japanese name. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the sharing. Super informative.
Yeah.
Before we jump straight to the stuff in the pigeonhole, does anyone want to just open the floor? Does anyone want to ask questions, like maybe very specific to the sharing? Anyone at all? They're usually questions. I think we're so used to the pigeonhole thing.
Yeah, now everyone's all over the pigeonhole. It's like,
yeah, everyone's gonna keep quiet. Okay, so what happened now is that's the pigeonhole. I'm gonna ask the questions. All
right.
And then, but we'll get the people to elaborate on their questions a bit more, so it's a bit more interactive. We'll start with Kai's question. Kai's question is, how is the tech culture different between GovTech and startups in the Silicon Valley, like Samsara and Databricks? Kai, do you wanna?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's the question.
No elaboration as it stands. I think there's many dimensions of culture. So I did touch upon this a little bit, right? So I think at GovTech there was actually a huge emphasis on quality of software engineering. So we spent a lot of time writing tests for our software. We really did like really good QA. And I would say that like in some startups, especially at late stage startups, it's a little bit, it's not as good, like I often find bugs in the product that Databricks pushes out. And in fact, it is a conscious choice to, be faster at the expense of quality, right? So, a product that is 100% bug-free, I'm sure you've heard this about security. The most secure code is no code, right? So the corollary is like a product that's 100% bug-free is like no product. I think that is a big difference. And I think that drives a lot of different things within the culture.
Kai, anything to add on?
Yeah. How about in terms of like if from our perspective as engineers, right? If we were to go to either GovTech or a tech company or a tech company in Silicon Valley as a software engineer, would other than that kind of shipping speed, is there anything else we would notice that would be different?
Yeah, so I think the shipping speed definitely accelerates your learning cycles, right? So if you can, push out, the more features you deliver, the more like people use your software, the more like scale your software sees, the more you learn as an engineer. So I think that's kind of the corollary. Scale is actually a big one. I would say that I didn't really learn too much about scale when I was in GovTech. Even if we had an app that was used by all, like 5 million people in Singapore, which obviously isn't possible, it's still not quite the same scale as something you would see in like a Silicon Valley startup. So I think that's a really fundamental part of engineering. And there are very few places you can learn that except at larger companies.
Awesome.
Great. Next question. I'm gonna group a couple questions together. So we're gonna bounce off this trace together theme. Not trace together, GovTech theme.
Okay. I did see the trace together question.
So my question, what are your thoughts on trace together? And then I think we're gonna sort of like keep it thematically about tech being an extension of human intention.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask Kai's question next, which is like the conflict and vision you had when you were at Samsara.
Yeah. So okay, the trace together question. Honestly, I don't really know too much about trace together. And you guys spoke to Joel, right?
Joel came.
Was one of the engineers.
But it might have been one of the previous batches, so maybe not this specific.
Oh, not this batch. Got it. Yeah. So I would I don't know if he got asked that question, but I think it's something that I'm not really best positioned to answer, having not really been involved. I did hear.
That's okay.
I'm not involved in the development. I understand the purpose, and I think maybe my whole thing is like, again, going back to tech as an extension of human intent, right? It is all about the mindset of whoever built it or whoever was responsible for the feature set, and that that comes out in the technology, right? So I think to draw maybe not to draw an analogy, but like if you think about Facebook and kind of the controversies that like Facebook is having, a lot of it is because of its revenue model, right? So I think it's like a much broader topic than really like the engineering part of things.
Also mindful that this video is recorded. I will go on. So staying the theme of like tech as an extension of human intent, and what exactly, could you elaborate a bit more, like what conflicts you had with the vision when you had Samsara? How AI was being used that you disagreed with?
Yeah, totally. So I think maybe one thing I want to clarify is that it's work in progress, right? Like as of when I left, it wasn't something that was like fixed, and that Samsara wasn't changing its policy on it. I think I definitely do generally have a sense of discomfort when it comes to AI, and I think a lot of it is how it's implemented and what is used to train the model. I think like there are quite a lot of initiatives around this. I know, for example, Google has like an AI ethics committee. So I think it's still early days to see how companies operationalize the concept of AI ethics. But I think it's really important. And I think for me, my discomfort is, it's not a mature enough this topic in general isn't mature enough for me to feel like I want to spend my time working on it in a way that may not be contributing good to society, if that makes sense.
It's surprising that you say that's not mature enough, because like the moment self-driving cars became conceptually a thing, you would have all those like, should I avoid the car or should I avoid the pedestrian? So you think right now in 2021 it's still not mature enough?
I think that's a little different, right? Like I think AI is essentially automating decisions, and there are different kinds of decisions, right? Like we have a decision of like, okay, what do you want to eat, right? And even that can be ethical, right? Like, should I go vegetarian or should I eat meat? And where does my meat come from? So I think it's like a big space, and there's still like years, if not decades of work left to do there. At least for now, like it's not something that I understand enough, honestly, to really like feel confident on.
Next question from Therese, also staying with AI, would be kind of an open-ended. What's your stance on shoving AI into everything? It's kind of a buzzword now. Everybody wants to say, we are AI powered. We're on the blockchain.
The funny thing is, I feel like AI is already like, if you look at like the curve of hype, right? AI is already kind of like, everyone's hyping about like crypto now, right? And like AI is still like 2 years ago. But I mean, there's a lot of different things, right? Like people are shoving in AI for marketing reasons and for like, branding reasons, for like fundraising reasons. So, I think, take everything with a grain of salt is how I look at it. I would say that the work that needs to be done to make AI successful, and I see a lot of this at Databricks actually, is like 98% of the effort is cleaning your data, making sure you know what your data means, making sure that you're building a good pipeline so that fresh data gets into your system. That's like 98% of the work. The like whatever modeling or whatever neural networks that you have is really the 2%. And I can tell you that like that 98% is like very, very difficult. So yeah.
Okay, Therese, do you have anything else to follow up on?
Oh yeah, to add on to that,
Yeah.
I believe just now you mentioned something about how these AI models are trained, right? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think a fundamental part of like AI, especially like unsupervised, well, not necessarily unsupervised learning, but a fundamental part of AI is like the data, right? So you need to have lots of data. You need to have positive examples and you need to have negative examples, right? So I guess like maybe, when you say elaborate on that, what do you mean like elaborate on what that concept is, or?
Like how certain implicit biases might produce results that, lay people like us may not be exactly aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you've hit it on the head. I think there's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. I saw someone ask for book references. And this is a really good one. So yeah, I encourage everyone to read it. I encourage people to purchase it from, your bookstore as opposed to, Amazon. Yeah, I think, I feel like, you probably, know as much as I do here. It's really like, the value of the labels and the value of the data going into the system determines kind of the value of the model itself. So it's very easy to have poor data or poor labeling or both.
There's that.
I just have a,
Yeah, Pat, go ahead.
Yeah. Therese, do you have does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
I just had a follow-up question on the comment earlier about how 98% of AI and machine learning is on the preparing the data and 2% is on the algorithms. I get a lot of questions from prospective students at Rocket Academy who are they've heard about the AI hype and they're thinking, hey, should I be a software engineer or should I be a data scientist or should I be an AI person? And often I struggle a little bit because personally I feel that software engineering will, for anyone who's working in a tech career, I think software engineering is a good foundation to branch out from. But I also don't want to say, no, you shouldn't be a data scientist. You should pick up coding first and then pick up the statistics later.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah.
When should someone think about being a so-called data scientist or software engineer?
Totally. Yeah, I think, there are some overlaps in skills, which is, coding skills, right? I think the expectation for data scientists is that you do know how to code, although, I think there's less expectations in terms of like systems design or architecture. I would say a big part of it is just like, what do you find fulfillment from? Because the nature of the job is actually very different if you're a data scientist versus a software engineer. Like when you're a software engineer, you're building products for people to use. You are like you're designing systems. When you are a data scientist or even a machine learning scientist, you're not designing systems per se. You are coming up with hypotheses and you're modeling. So at least from my perspective, if you like creating things and if you like building things, then you really should be a software engineer. But if you like experimenting and if you like coming up with hypotheses and if you like analyzing, then I think you probably are more suited for data science or machine learning. So it's actually two very different jobs. And I often see people, who start off as data scientists and actually find it pretty dry because again, a lot of times you're just doing the same things. You're like looking at the mean, looking at the median, fitting the same models, just like doing a bunch of stuff over and over again. And I think something else to consider is also like, what are the data science domains? And oftentimes it is in areas like advertising or like, funnel conversion. So another big question is like, do you, are you interested in those things?
And for a career switcher who wants to get into data science, let's say they check those boxes, they're passionate about those things. What's the best way to do that short of going back to university and studying statistics?
I don't think I'm actually very well suited to answer this. I think I have a little bit of insight into how you interview as a data scientist. So, a lot of it is like what we look out for when we hire data scientists is like understanding the business use case, like actually understanding what we're trying to validate. So a lot of times, you'll find that you get case study interviews as a data scientist. I guess I can't really specifically, I can't really be more specific to that.
Not the most high-worded question, but Mike was asking thematically, what would make a good, or what do you look for in an entry-level data scientist or machine learning engineer? Maybe very quickly.
I actually, this is really not kind of my expertise, to be honest.
Okay, that's okay.
Again,
that's fine.
Ask me about the software engineers.
All right.
Even though Samsara, Databricks is a data science and AI platform, 95% of our engineers are software engineers as opposed to data scientists.
Okay, keep the questions coming. I'm just going to stick with the tech questions first, and we'll move to all the tech questions at the end. So Therese has another question that you mentioned that your work at GovTech was to also establish or transform the engineering culture from being process-driven to user-driven. Her question was, how do you sustain these changes when you scale? So I'm not sure how, what you joined with only 2 software engineers, and when you leave, for example. So I guess you the example of brain drain and entropy. Therese, did I do a good enough job explaining your question? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and by entropy brain drain, you mean like from GovTech, or do you mean? I guess I'm curious.
Just as people come and go, because I feel that without any sustained effort to maintain these changes, eventually all culture loses its spark.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's a pretty broad question. I would say a lot of it, it can be personality driven. And anecdotally, I've seen a couple of teams not teams that I directly manage, but basically it's a team of 5. The tech lead was driving a lot of the culture of the team. And when the tech lead left, the team basically fell apart, right? Didn't deliver anything for a quarter. Everybody was depressed. In this particular case that I'm thinking of, I think half the team quit. So it was a very extreme example, but it can get pretty bad. I think from my perspective, I always think about what does the team look like if I were gone, right? And I actually practice that by leaving. My favorite vacation is backpacking. So I actually go off here in California. We have a lot of mountains. So I actually go off in the mountains for 2 weeks, and I not only am I not checking my phone, it doesn't matter because there's no cell reception. So I make a very deliberate effort to actually remove myself from the team. And then I come back and I'm like, hey, how did things go? What was done, what was not done, what was missing. And I tried to make an assessment there. So, I guess, I can't specifically tell you how, but I can tell you how to diagnose it. And, this is one of the ways I do it, and also to demonstrate, good work-life balance and to set a good example of actually taking time off.
So it's just simulating what would happen if you were away.
Yeah. And I think as a lead, I always try to consciously withdraw myself, especially when there is someone with potential that can step into the lead position, right? So, delegation, giving them enough support, but also a little bit of discomfort. But then, also still being there for them, right? I think that's how I've, made it work in the past, and so far it's been good. I'm
going to segue from that question. As a lead, as a tech lead, or as an engineering manager, how much leverage do you think you have to influence the own microculture in your team, as opposed to the macroculture of the organization you're in? So with a startup, or with GovTech with 2 engineers, surely the culture is going to be fairly homogeneous. But in large, whether it's at Samsara or Databricks or as your experience as a manager, do you feel that there's a balance to be struck between creating your own culture with your team? That that you can diagnose yourself when you go backpacking and having to navigate the culture you join.
I think I do have, especially within my team. Yes, I think as a lead. I'm actually reading this book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave. It's pretty dense, and I honestly, personally don't really, I don't know, I skim over a lot of chapters, especially when he goes into the neurobiology of things. But one of his observations was that humans intuitively mimic the behavior of people higher in status, right? And that's just like a built-in part of our biology. And then, it's like, we can try to be conscious about it, but it is just very challenging. So, I think as a leader, I always try to set an example. And I think I can actually, influence the culture of the team a lot by doing that. I would say like on the larger company, it's much more difficult, especially in this remote era where you are not observing how people work and, you're not really like, you have to be very intentional interacting with people outside of your team. I think I do have, and the other kind of like lever I have is feedback, right? So one of the most important things that I discuss with my team, like the first time I meet them, is how I like to give feedback and how they would like to receive feedback, and really like building that trust around giving and receiving feedback. And the goal here is like, I want to make sure that they hear my feedback as, it's like with the best intentions, like I'm helping give them feedback on how they can grow. And it's not to like criticize what they're doing or to, kind of, like the feedback should always be like positive and with a view towards growth. So it's surprisingly effective. I think I've kind of, I would say like earlier in my career, I've made some mistakes on that point on feedback. But in the more recent years, I think it's been a much more effective tool in my arsenal.
Thanks. And just to stay in that theme of like being a manager. So how was the transition from IC to engineering manager? And what do you enjoy about managing? What do you miss about software engineering? And the same way you did, like a litmus test for someone who's interested in data science versus software engineering, what would be a litmus test for engineering management versus just IC?
Yeah, totally. I think it's like part of my personality, part of like what motivates me. I think I've always been drawn towards a lead role. So, very early on in GovTech, like maybe like a year in, it was like, okay, well, I'm already doing the things that I need to lead the team, right? Like making sure that people have projects, making sure that, we're not blocked, trying to liaison with people outside of the team. So yeah, I might as well, have this title. I would say in general, that's how I think about growing team leads as well. A lot of times, people naturally fall into that position, especially if there's a gap in the team for that. And I think, I think that is, of course, makes the job easier for me in terms of growing team leads. What I really enjoy about engineering management, and by the way, you can be a lead without being a manager. So I think, I'm not sure how, so most companies in Silicon Valley, there is like a manager path and IC path. And, as like an IC, so your title would be something like staff engineer or senior staff engineer or principal engineer. You are overseeing a product area of, potentially like hundreds of engineers. And you are also responsible for coaching and mentoring. You're also responsible for, a lot of the impact that, you might associate with an engineering manager, but you don't directly manage anybody. So it's still, you can still do all these things and not be a manager. I would say for me, the biggest part of like what I like about engineering management is coaching and mentoring. I really enjoy working through people. I really enjoy kind of hearing how people think about the world and think about what they do and their kind of like internal mindsets. And I just find that fascinating. And like, you know, for me, like, if I think about the moments in my past week that have been like revelationary, it's like when I talked to someone and they gave me a different perspective about how they saw things. So I think, you know, that kind of fits very naturally with the engineering management role. I would say another strength of mine is planning. So I enjoy planning. It comes naturally to me, you know. So it's really about like aligning what I do well with my kind of what, you know, motivates me. And, you know, as far as I know, you know, that's the engineering management role and how that fits with.
Is there anything about being an IC that you miss, that you I'm be surprised that you miss?
Yeah. So I would say that it depends on, a lot of this depends on a company. So Google, for example, is kind of known for mixing the IC and manager role into this TLM role, tech lead manager. And oftentimes you have tech lead managers who's responsible for both people management and product direction for like anywhere from like 5 to like 50 people. So
Wow.
I think something, if I were to name anything I miss being able to take the time to define the direction of a group of engineers and to drive really the product direction for that. And, you know, different companies have it differently. Like some companies, you know, it's really the product manager who goes into the detail of what the product should look like and really drive that. I would say Databricks is a little bit unique in that we actually have a lot of engineers drive it. But that's because we're building products for engineers. So a lot of times it's pretty technical, and you know, engineers are best suited to kind of drive those decisions.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Mike about IoT and AI. Mike's asking if he's currently a software engineer and he's interested in Internet of Things or AI. Would you have like a recommendation how like either probe that interest, check if that interest is valid, or if it is valid, how would you get into that scene?
Yeah, totally. So I think for IoT, it's pretty, I would say that like find a company that builds IoT devices. I probably would recommend a company that does both the, like they own the stack, if that makes sense. There's some IoT companies that are only software and then they use like a third-party hardware, third-party hardware and firmware, and that gets a little tricky. So I would say it's pretty straightforward to get into IoT. Just join an IoT company, and a lot of them have like full software roles. So, you know, even at Samsara, and this is like something that was a surprise to one of the Samsara founders. He was surprised by the ratio of full stack cloud software engineers to firmware engineers. I think he expected that he would have like, you know, roughly 1-to-1, like cloud software, you know, working on the platform, like the, you know, like the UI and all the like cloud side of things. And he kind of assumed that, you know, he would have 1-to-1 ratio of that with firmware, but it actually was more like 5-to-1. It turns out that it's, you know, IoT is still challenging. I think when you write firmware, it's tricky because you're working in a fairly proprietary ecosystem. You know, there are lots of limitations on memory and CPU availability on firmware devices. So you can just grow much faster on the software side. Plus, you know, like the important thing with IoT, it's still how you look at the data and how you make use of the data and how you build workflows around the data. So yeah, so that would be my suggestion for IoT. As far as AI goes, I think the best way to go into that as a software engineer is to find AI adjacent teams. So one common pattern of how AI is structured in a lot of, again, I'm more familiar with bigger companies, is like you have a team of like machine learning scientists or data scientists, and they often are partnered with a corresponding software engineering team. And that software engineering team is responsible for operationalizing and productionizing the data science part of it. So a lot of that is like, you know, some of the keywords would be like data pipelines, right? Or data platform, or, you know, Databricks. So I think or like streaming, So yeah, so I think that would be kind of how I would look into it.
Right. Mike, is there anything you wanted to ask to follow up on?
And I was just, you said 5:1, so that means 5 firmware engineers to 1 cloud.
No, it's actually the opposite. Yeah. So it turns out that it's because firmware features are hard to build, and for every one firmware feature, you actually need like 5 software engineers to take that firmware feature and make it useful within the context of like a business that's purchasing the IoT product.
Okay. Okay.
But firmware engineers are also writing software, right? Because
yeah. But the skill set is pretty different. Like, it's like C++. Oftentimes you're kind of the constraints are different, right? Like I kind of mentioned, like memory constraints, which usually software engineers don't really think about. You just like, I have 8 gigabytes of memory in the cloud. Who cares? Yeah. So the skill set is a little different. Yeah.
But so the recommendation for people who are interested in IoT is to try out doing firmware development.
No, the recommendation is to find an IoT company, and I can guarantee that whatever IoT company you find will have just like traditional full stack cloud software roles, because a lot of it again is like about presenting that data to a user, and that has to be done through the cloud.
Yeah.
Right, Mike, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, our final tech question before we move to all the non-tech ones and book recommendations would be from Kai. Why the passion for enterprise apps, and why not consumer apps?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I personally find enterprise a much easier domain to understand. In general, business users are pretty good at telling you what they want, and I think that's good, right? I mean, it helps, building a product that they actually use. I also think that, part of it is the fact that consumer ads already get a lot of attention and they just get a lot of mind share, right? Because everyone's like, oh, I have Facebook or Google. So in a way, like, I think going into enterprise is a strategy. I think there is like an imbalance in terms of the value that people perceive. And fewer people might know or are attracted to enterprise. And I think generally the way that I like to think about product development is also being able to, another point is in general, enterprise apps tends to be, the incentive for enterprise tends to be a little bit more aligned between who's paying for the product and who's the user of the product. So there's less of a tendency to have side effects. So, if you think about a lot of like the popular consumer apps, a lot of times they're freemium, right? So either it's, advertising that's paying for it, or they have, like, if you think about mobile games, like it's free, but then they have all these like mechanics to make you like, buy whatever loot boxes and everything. And I think that just isn't quite aligned with, how I like to spend my time.
Kai, does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah, your belief in tech being an extension of human attention is really coming across, and that it should be a force for good, and that it's important to have be aligned with vision. Actions speak much louder. Okay, so we'll take a change of pace. We'll go to the non-tech questions with the highest voted one right now. From Tian. Tian is inferring that you're into philosophy. And she's asking, you have already recommended a bunch of books, but do you have any more to recommend? Or maybe to scope a question a bit more, would you have a book specifically to recommend for careers such as coming to software?
I can share a couple of books that, I have a lot of engineering management books that I actually haven't read, so I'm not gonna recommend those. But the ones that I have read there's a good book called The Manager's Path. So for anybody who is considering engineering management, or I think this is actually a good read even if you're not an engineering manager, because you know what to expect from a manager. I think a lot of times especially if you haven't had any working experience before, you're kind of like, oh yeah, well, like whatever my manager says is like Correct, right? And a lot of times, like the way you become more senior is kind of giving feedback to your manager. So this is a really good one. I think another book that I have been recommending to my team, but I actually haven't revisited it recently, is The Effective Engineer. This one is maybe a little bit more practical, and I think it does touch upon some of the, I think when people ask like what the culture is, but the difference between culture, I think it does touch a little bit upon those concepts, right? Like, what are the right corners to cut, and how do you know that you're being productive as an engineer, as opposed to, I think one trap that some engineers do fall into is like, oh, I want to like build the perfect thing, right? Like I learned in my algorithms class that like O of 1 is better than O of n, right? But then when your n is 10, like does it matter? So I think, this touches a little bit about like the difference between computer science theory and really like software engineering. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have enough books for your bookshelf, Shan?
I added 2 more.
Don't lie to me. You have books you haven't read yet. Right?
Yeah, I have a long list.
All have books. And Shan has another question, which is how do you balance with all this reading? How do you balance work, life, and learning?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a big believer in kind of making the full use of my work time, and I'm also a big believer in setting personal boundaries. So one thing I definitely do is like I don't have Slack on my phone. My email is like in a different profile. There's like this work profile that it might be a Google thing. I don't know if you have that on Apple phones, but basically, I don't get any email notifications unless I intentionally turn on my work profile. And I really like, for me, it's like, okay, if I can't get all the things I need to do within a 40-hour week, I drop things. Like I intentionally will like, I don't need to read this, or like, I'm going to delegate, and maybe this project is going to be a little bit behind compared to me directly managing it, but like, that's okay. So it's worked for me so far. I do think it can be situational. But I do think it's something you have to develop over time. And maybe for you, personally, that's like a 50-hour week or a 60-hour week, right? But whatever it is, it's like recognizing kind of the need to set boundaries. So that's how I balance work. As far as learning goes, I guess I wouldn't say I'm like particularly regimented about my learning. Like I mentioned, I have all these books that I actually haven't read, even though, like it's been recommended to me. I think I try to be a little bit opportunistic with learning. So like whenever I meet someone, I try to ask them questions. And like it's like pretty straightforward, like, ask them 3 questions. And surprisingly, you can actually learn a lot without, really like sitting down and reading. So books are a source, but, I think learning can happen, all over. I do think a particular effective tool for my personal learning is reflection. So, if I think about 2 people who have, if I think about people on my team, and I think about 2 people who might have had the same starting point, right? Like maybe they joined at the same time, they were exposed to the same opportunities. Why is it that someone can grow much faster than the other person? And I think there's a big correlation with how much the person who's growing is reflecting on what they've done and what they can improve. And a lot of times, like those are my favorite things to talk about during my one-on-ones. So like when people come to me and be like, hey, this is what I learned, and like this is how I would do things differently. I think that really accelerates growth and learning. So, if it isn't a habit of yours already, I would encourage you to like set aside some time, maybe monthly, maybe even weekly, to just be like, hey, like, at the end of this week, what went well, what could have gone better, what did I learn? And find someone to share it with. I think, you'll be surprised by what additional insights you might get if you, articulated this to someone.
Are you regimental about your reflection? Do you do it once a week? No? Do you try to be?
Well, I would say that sometimes they do come to me. So I have a dog who I walk. So oftentimes, like I have reflections while I walk her. Backpacking, actually, I do a lot of reflecting when I backpack because, I'm like alone with my thoughts. but I think all these things that I'm like recommending is not, I don't like have.
may not be
on my
immediately
schedule.
transferable to Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have no mountains. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't put a lot of pressure on myself on that, honestly.
Okay.
I think I give recommendations, but I don't necessarily follow all or any.
Don't we all? Great answer. Being opportunistic about learning. Learning
Yeah.
the opportunity for
Yeah, and reflecting. I think
Yeah.
reflecting part is probably even more important.
Right. Tian, does that probably really very well?
Yeah, that's a very good
Yeah.
answer. Yeah.
Okay. Next we're just running out of time, 5 minutes. So
Yeah.
3 sets of questions about when we started this, we did kind of announce Tech for Sheep, but it didn't really pan out. But
Yeah.
as a champion, not passionate, but as a champion of underrepresented groups, why does that matter to you? Why do you find it important to increase representation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I definitely don't take this as like, like abrasive or anything. Yeah. I think for me personally is, I look at women in the workforce, in the past 50 years, and I recognize how fortunate I am to be here. And I really hope that, women 50 years, maybe hopefully sooner from now would be like seeing, a difference between how women are treated in the workplace today versus in 50 years in the future, right? So I think I want to be part of that change, and I want to help give, and not just women, I think like really like underrepresented group. I think, this falls along racial lines in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area a lot. So for me, it's like I have the luxury of being like, I think this is the morally right thing to do. Not everybody can be in that position. I think, when I was more junior in my career, I used to feel a lot more, I would say, antagonism towards, leadership. I'm like, oh yeah, like why aren't we doing more to hire underrepresented group? I think, having seen some of the challenges of like being like an engineering leader or just being a leader in a company, I think it's given me a much more nuanced take. But again, I still do have the kind of capability to do it, at least, in my free time here. Yeah, so, I think there's like lots of arguments, some people say like diversity is good for like outcomes. And I think, yeah, that's compelling. And there's a lot of research done on that. But for me, it's really like, I'm fortunate and privileged to be where I am. And it's really like because of all the work that people have done before me. So I hope to give forward.
Therese, is that comprehensive? Does anyone else have any questions on diversity or underrepresented groups?
Is there anything that we can do to better support underrepresented groups?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know what you do now, so maybe it's like already pretty good. I would say that, yeah, I think it's just always hard for when you're in an underrepresented group, right? Like, going back to Robert Sapolsky's book about Behave, like you're already at a heightened level of stress. So, just like physiologically, it's like much harder to do well. So I think in general, like, have more underrepresented people in leadership, make sure that these perspectives are heard, make sure that any advocacy is like recognized and part of the job, right? Like I think one common trap is people expecting women or people from underrepresented groups to do a diversity work like for free. It's like, oh, hey, like you're a woman, tell us about how we can improve, right? So I think, like, I mean, probably not super relevant for this audience, but like pay for consultancy work, right? Like there are experts out there and they're not going to be your like junior female engineer with 2 years of experience, right? Like pay for the consultancy, like take the feedback seriously and like actually, implement them. So yeah, those are some very smattering of pretty spread out thoughts.
Yeah, we'd love to pick your brain on what you think works and doesn't work. Diversity quotas, affirmative action, stuff like that. But we're kind of running out of time. And we usually end the Q&As with a general piece of advice. So all of you entering, some of them graduating this year will be software engineering ones. So do you have a general piece of advice for campus and soon to be software engineers?
Yeah. Gosh, general piece of advice.
Yeah, I didn't give you a heads up on this. Yeah, my bad.
Yeah, no, I think, generality is always challenging because how do you say something meaningful, but also.
All right, what did you wish you knew when you entered
yeah.
the software engineering industry?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's
Thanks,
it's an easy question for me to answer. Yeah. Yeah. I think I had definitely the misconception. So I think in Kai's introduction, you kind of mentioned I studied computer science at Stanford. I actually was not a CS major at all, and I think I only took like 4 real computer science classes.
I think that's very reassuring for our students.
Yeah.
You might have that CS insecurity.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I think what I want to maybe highlight is like a lot of what I learned came after school, and I had the misconception that like, oh yeah, I need to have taken like database classes and systems classes and like written my own compiler before I could be a real software engineer, which is not true. Software engineer is about problem solving, and code is only a tool for problem solving. So I would kind of I would orient your value really around like how can I best understand the problem that this company or this product is facing, how do I best solve that, and think of like the tool as a secondary aspect of your role. So I think that is where I see the most effective software engineers. They're very focused on the product, very focused on the customers, very focused on the use cases, and again, the technology is part of it, but again, back to extension of human intent. It's only an extension. It can only do what we asked it to do.
All right. Thanks for all the great sharing, the answers as well. That brings us to an end. So thanks, Z, for joining us. It's like 9 p.m. San Fran time, Wednesday night. You could be doing a lot of different things. Thanks.